Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Kathryn Eident, the Marketing and Communications Director at Housing Assistance Corporation, and I'm your host today. We're going to be talking about homelessness across Cape Cod, but with a specific focus on the town of Falmouth. And joining me for the discussion today is Gina Torielli, Executive Director of Belonging to Each Other, Elyse DeGroot, Director of Development and Community Relations, also at Belonging to Each Other, Suzie Hauptmann, the Director of Human Services for the town of Falmouth, and Tim Regan, Assistant Director of Individual Homeless Services at Housing Assistance Corporation. Thanks everybody for joining me.
Sure, thanks for having us.
Before we kind of dig into talking about homelessness, I wanted to talk a little bit about our organizations first and give everybody a sense of what we're doing about this issue. So Gina, tell us a little bit more about Belonging to Each Other.
Sure. Belonging to Each Other is a community-based private nonprofit here in Falmouth. We provide cold weather temporary housing and year-round supportive services to people in Falmouth, adults who are experiencing homelessness.
Mm-hmm. Elyse, do you want to add anything?
So it really is a community-based program. We have about 60 volunteers who help us with the various services that we provide. And it's as Gina mentioned, it is winter cold weather housing. So our program is open from the beginning of November through the end of April.
Okay. And Suzie, you're Human Services Director for the town of Falmouth, and your work has a wide scope, but you do also have a focus on homelessness. So can you explain?
Sure. So Falmouth Human Services is a town department. We are part of the town's operating budget, and we are often a first stop for local residents who are in need of any level of human service, whether it be homelessness services, mental health services, housing and security, and access to other community resources. And we have 3 clinical social workers on staff, plus myself and an administrative assistant, and we look at ourselves often as a safety net for Falmouth residents.
Okay, thank you. And Tim, Housing Assistance Corporation helps Cape Codders on a wide variety of issues, including homelessness, all the way up to home ownership. But of course, you're working in outreach and prevention with homeless folks and people experiencing homelessness. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we have 3 outreach specialists and a couple of what we call permanent support housing case managers who work specifically with folks on Cape Cod who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability. You know, our goal is to get out in the field, meet the folks where they're at, learn who's out there, find out what trends we're looking for, get them housed, get them services, connect them to anything that they may need, and provide any other support that we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so, you know, I think some residents might actually be surprised to know that there are people who experience homelessness in Falmouth. I want to talk first a little bit about numbers. So maybe I'll start with you, Suzie, because
Sure.
You're coming from a town perspective. How many people do you encounter in your work that are experiencing homelessness?
Well, just to give a sense of the past 2 years, our department helps to convene a network of agencies. It's called the Essential Services Network, and we started that in 2017. And we used to meet monthly. Now we, we meet every other week. And in FY 21, because we run by the fiscal year, we case conferenced at those meetings a total of, I think it was 62 homeless individuals. Those are unduplicated individuals that that my department and the other agencies encountered with. And then just in this past fiscal year, it was 108. So that was quite a jump. And I think there are more folks that are out there, and we're also a lot more coordinated in our efforts. And so we're able to identify folks a lot sooner and help, get them connected to the right agency and the right pathway.
Yeah, even with just looking at these numbers, it hints to the fact that the issue is complicated.
Oh yeah.
So there are more than one factor at play.
Yep.
Elyse and Gina, you mentioned that you do a lot of work in the winter, and we've had a fairly mild winter. We're heading towards spring. It's still cold out. We did have that Arctic snap in January. That
Sure
cold
did.
snap. I know you were active. I know Housing Assistance and Tim, you were active, but I want to hear a little bit about what you did that weekend that kind of highlights the number of homeless people in Falmouth.
Sure. Well, that first weekend in February, well, remember it was below zero, right? And as a group, we realized that we were going to have a lot of people in town who are used to living in a car or in a tent that really wouldn't be able to survive that kind of weather. So collectively, we went through our list, which at the time was about 40 people, you know, for that one snapshot in time. And that would be in addition to the 12 people that were already sheltering with belonging to each other on a more continuous basis. So we went out and the outreach folks like Tim, you know, found everyone, tried to get them into a program that's funded by the Duffy Health Center, provide hotels in Falmouth, and then belonging to each other's role in that is to both help bring folks in, but also to feed them. So we had a cadre of volunteers that were putting together, it turned out to be a total of, trying to remember that number, 21 who were in the hotels, plus another 12 we had. So that was 33 people at one point in time that we had actually been able to get into shelter on that cold time. And I know there were more people out there than that.
Right, it's who you can find.
It's who you can find,
yeah,
right.
it's
right.
who you can find. Tim, I'm wondering if you can give us more of a regional kind of just look at how many people across the Cape experience homelessness based on what you know in your work.
Yeah, so that's a number we talk about a lot. We meet almost weekly to try and track that, you know, where we're going with that. You know, just from a organizational standpoint, from Hack Outreach, just in the last year, going from March 1st, 2022 to March 1st, 2023, we had 180 brand new folks that had not been registered in our system before. And that's from basically, you know, our outreach workers going out, finding the folks, doing the intakes, and completing the process and entering into what we call HMIS, which is Homeless Management Innovation System. But there's always a sort of understanding that number is on the low end, because those are the folks that engage with us. We know at least probably 25, 30% more folks that don't engage with us that are probably out there as well. So, you know, realistically, you could be looking at over 200 easily folks that we know of that are either engaging with us or not engaging with us on Barnstable County alone.
So I'm curious, how do you know where to find these people? You know, you say that it's 180 new people.
Yep.
How do you find out where they are?
It's really the backbone of, number one, working as a team. You know,
Right.
we all work together really well. We meet on every weekly basis. Someone sees something, we look into it, or someone presents to Falmouth Human Services, you know. It's a phone call to Stefan or myself, and we're right down there.
Right.
You know, or Gina or
Yeah.
Elyse. But it's really just getting out there, you know. Our outreach specialists really just get out to where people might think they are, or even where we think they might not be.
Right.
Just looking for areas, looking for folks, you know, looking for folks, like somebody's just hanging out in their car for a long time. Knock on the car window and find out what's their situation. We found a lot of folks like
Right.
that.
I was also going to mention the Falmouth Police Department is a member of our team as well, and they often are the ones that might identify someone in a parking lot, or even that might go to the police station, or someone would call them. So that's also another way in which folks get identified.
Yeah.
Kathryn, maybe you were going to get to this, and you probably were because you're super organized. So what should somebody do if they notice somebody in their car or a tent on the side of the, you know, in the woods someplace? What should people do? Call
Whoever. As Suzie says, it doesn't even have to be Hack,
Right.
because we work
Yep.
with the police department, the
Yep.
Falmouth Human Services, and everyone else. We'll get that information. You can call our main line too,
Okay,
and
good.
they'll connect us to
I
our
feel like
outreach
any
too.
one of the belonging to each other, Hack, Falmouth Police Department, Falmouth Human Services are really the key agencies in Falmouth that even if a resident just has it, and this happens quite frequently, someone will call and say, I
Right.
noticed someone at the T-Ticket bus stop, and they'll describe them to one of
Yep.
us, and often we'll say, we recognize, or I might know that I recognize that person, and I'll alert the rest of the team, and when we meet, we say this person was seen, and they might already be engaged in some level of service, and then oftentimes, as Tim said, there's some folks that for whatever reasons that they're experiencing right now, they're not really interested in engaging in
Right.
services, so they kind of just stay on our radar. We keep our eyes out for them and continue to approach and engage and hope that maybe they'd be willing to access health care or go to a meal at St. Barnabas Church, which is happening today. And at that point, one of the caseworkers can hopefully begin to work with them.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the network, but let's talk a little bit more about that and explain. So obviously our organizations are a part of it, but you just mentioned St. Barnabas Church does regular meals for people. So talk about that. Give us a little history on that.
Well, St. Barnabas, I wish I had the information at my fingertips. Tim might know, but I think it's twice a month. Or is it every week now?
It's every week now.
It's every week, every
Yeah.
Tuesday. Every Tuesday,
Yeah.
they prepare a meal, and so I know that Stefan, the other HAC outreach worker, will be there, and other outreach workers, and hopefully that builds up, some folks just stopping by and having lunch and having a warm meal, and it's an opportunity to engage and build some level of rapport. So there's that going on.
And that's open to just anybody,
Anybody,
right?
yeah,
Anybody can
anybody
go.
that wants a meal.
Yep.
So for years they did something called Around the Table, and then I think after the pandemic they kind of took a hiatus, and now they're back and doing it even more frequently. So it's a great outreach opportunity.
Let's talk a little bit more about the face of homelessness. You talked about how you have to kind of, I would say, be creative in thinking about where you might find people, or looking at people you might encounter and kind of reading between the lines and saying, wait a minute, this person might need help. I kind of want to talk about something that a lot of Falmouth residents probably know about, and that's the Eastman hardware block. That building was sold, and you might not think homelessness would be part of this story, but it is part of the story. So Gina, tell us about what happened with that apartment block, and then we can talk about other people that we encounter, but I wanted to start with that first.
Sure. So the apartments above Eastman's, like many of the places downtown, they're apartments upstairs, and they had been renting for a very long time at a very low rate to people. So there were about 11 apartments up there, and some people had been there for decades. And when the property changed hands, there was a need for updating or what have you, and so all of the folks up there were told that they needed to leave, and they had about 36 days to do that. And so, the various agencies, I know, Falmouth Human Services convened a meeting for those folks who were interested in help finding new housing. HAC worked with them. We had folks who ended up with us for a period of time from there. But that was 11 apartments that were renting at a fairly low rate. And that kind of housing is really disappearing here on the Cape. It's either getting converted to higher priced housing, or people are coming in and buying it to live here in town now rather than rent. So there really is the housing that people who are making $10, $20, even $30 an hour can access is the housing that's really eroding here in town. And 11 units is a lot of units for a town like Falmouth that has,
And
is
they
not
didn't know
huge.
they didn't know what to do. They were kind
Right.
of shell shocked, So we kind of, circled the wagons, and we posted notices on all their doors saying, if you'd like to come to town hall for a meeting, we'll have representatives from the following agencies. We had legal aid there, we had the Falmouth Housing Authority there, and just tried to help explain to them what to expect during the process too, because they didn't know, what does an eviction mean? They didn't know what housing court was versus regular court. So we tried to help educate them through the process and then connect them to the services that they
Yeah,
need.
I mean,
and
these are
that
folks
many
who've
of-
been living on their Social Security or what have you.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not lavishly, but they were okay where they were. But that disruption, and it could be a disruption that's a big medical bill or a health crisis or a variety of things, just sort of throws them out.
And back to the face of homelessness,
Yeah.
most of them were over the age of 60.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were older.
And that's something we are seeing in our residential program. Two seasons ago, we're in our 8th season, and our 6th season, the largest population segment was 25 to 35, which is kind of what we traditionally think about as, people who are going to be out in the streets. Last year it was 1 out of 3 was over 60. This year it's more than half.
Wow.
And we've had people all the way up to age 83 this year, who got dislocated for whatever reason and need to get connected up. And that's not an easy time to start over.
No, especially as you mentioned, there are not a lot of units available, period. Never mind
Right.
units that are actually something that they can afford on
Right.
whatever income that they may have or savings that they may be using.
It's
for
rental.
this.
It needs to be rentals, and it needs to be reasonably priced.
And I think that that's been really educational for people in town to see that the face of homelessness really can be so diverse. And I think that people have some assumptions and stereotypes in their minds about what it means to be homeless. And I think that especially with the Eastman block, that was a real eye-opener for people around here.
Yeah, because it's a different way of thinking about how close a large section of our community is to being homeless. It just takes one thing to kind of tip them over the edge, and then they're in this group, this new population, that's in a crisis, really.
Right.
Right.
Tim, are you seeing more older people in your work and when you're out and about?
Yeah, just from that 180 number I gave you, the largest representation of folks entered in the system was 62 and older. And that really just matches what everyone else is seeing in the community. You got folks that, were leading relatively steady lives. And this isn't, a new thing. These are folks that were housed for 30, 40 years. What happens is you get somebody that can't afford their mortgage anymore or their rent because their Social Security check can't keep up and they can't work anymore. They're just losing their housing because the prices are just outweighing the cost of living these days. And, it really, there's always a sense of, at least amongst the team, more motivation, sort of a fire when we hear about the 80-year-old in the car. Because these are the folks that, their life expectancy in a car is not going to be that high.
No.
Right.
They're folks with medical problems, they need a nice warm place to treat, to do their treatments. And, if they have an oxygen concentrator, they take on that. You can't do that in a car.
Yeah.
So every time we see someone, 70, 80 years old, there's always like this big frustration, but also a motivator to get us, like, we need to really
Move
help these
fast.
folks,
Move fast.
get them
yeah.
wherever they need to go.
Yeah,
And
we
it's
had a
and it-
person where we got a call from the Falmouth Housing Authority because he was trying to navigate that system, and they called and said, "Can you make room for him? He's blue. He's blue. He was so cold." But I would like to point out, I mean, yes, the elderly population is growing, but I think there's equally that dynamic on the younger side, but there's more mobility. So what we're seeing is, the younger folks who might be working in town, or, people think of their kids and grandkids wanting to stay in town, they're moving off Cape, and they may end up driving back here to work. And the other piece of it is, there are a lot of people trying to make it here in Falmouth working, but you really can't.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about, minimum wage, but, fairly high up where you just can't make it, particularly if you have childcare layered on top of it. So we're losing the workers here in town, and I think that's why you see organizations like the Falmouth Chambers, doing programming and talking about this, because it's going to be critical to everyone, and if we lose that population, the workers.
Yeah, we're seeing it go upstream. It's not just a certain subset of people.
Right.
Are people who are becoming homeless, who are working, are some of them staying around on the Cape, or are we seeing more of an exodus of people leaving in the working age group?
I think there's definitely an exodus on the lower end. When you're young, it's easy to sort of relocate because you may have a tie, you're more open to the whatever world is on the other side of the bridge there. Whereas some of the older folks, this is where they grew up. This is their lives. This is their memories. Their families are here. It's going to be very hard to convince someone to, sort of pack up and leave when everything is here. I always tell this story. One of my favorite restaurants in town, there's a server there that he is homeless. You would never know because, he presents so well. I always tip him really well every time I go there, but it's right in front of our eyes.
Yep.
And sometimes a younger population too, or it's a little bit easier for them to do like the couch surfing model. They'll stay with a friend here and there. They do not have their own place to call home, so they'll make do and try and stay with folks and keep it together. And those are the folks we want to see come through our doors too, because we really want to help them, get on any subsidized housing wait lists and that sort of thing. But yeah, there's the hidden homeless too. There are just squeezing by, or during the summer they might decide to camp, so that they can get out of
Right.
their winter rental and and then kind of keep their job and keep showering and while they're at a campground.
The other pattern we've seen, it belonging to each other, is people, and I'm sure you all have seen it as well, is people are using their cars as their home, and there seems to be an increase in that. And it's not clear, maybe if you own a car, then it's a lot less expensive to stay there than trying to find a place to rent. And then there's the subsection that have pets, and they can't find a place to rent that will take them and their pet. So it's easier to stay in the car with their animal than to find a place to live. And that's been a big change
That's a
too, I
challenge,
think.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a lot of, the first expense people think about is maintaining that vehicle, and sometimes that's counterintuitive when you don't have a home, but the vehicle can be both
Be the home.
your home and in some cases employment.
Right.
A fair number of people who are homeless are doing delivery. Particularly in the warmer weather, they can make halfway decent money and give themselves enough money to maybe get into a hotel once in a while and wash up.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, and without a car on the Cape, it's really difficult to get around.
Right.
So you can understand why somebody might prioritize keeping that and
Right.
putting their money toward that, because it is becomes almost like a Swiss Army knife,
Right.
kind of a tool for somebody to try to make, they're not making ends meet, but just to try to survive.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's really something to see somebody camping, essentially in their car where they work,
Yeah.
or, at the friend's or neighbor's house or whatever. But, the
Yeah.
idea of, just parking outside work just gets to me.
And that's actually a relatively common thing. Someone
Absolutely.
will park, go to work a 16-hour shift because they're inside, go sleep in their car in the parking lot, and come back the next day. That is just, I couldn't imagine. You're living to work at that point.
Literally living
Literally
to work.
live work.
Right.
Work
Yeah.
to living, yeah.
The pandemic, we've gone through so many kind of waves and different phases of the pandemic. Are you still seeing kind of impacts in your work? Is that affecting who you're seeing become homeless?
I think the pandemic contributed to a lot of folks returning to their homes that were rentals, and then thus evicting people. So that there was that population of folks, and so that I think we're still feeling the effects of that. There was a lot. We all saw the kind of real estate boom where people just decided, okay, I'm going to cash out now, sell my house, and this person that's been renting for the past 20 years is going to, have to find someplace else, and there just was no place else.
And I was wondering whether that was part of what you were talking about, Tim, with the big increase in numbers you all saw, was whether that was pandemic related.
Oh, 100%.
Because as you were
Yeah.
saying, there's the upstream effects and there's the downstream effects,
Yeah.
and that may be a downstream effect of
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Whereas, a lot of people think of the pandemic, of the shut-in, where mask up, all that. We have to look at it the scope of, how many folks are becoming homeless because the landlord sold, or, it's being turned into an Airbnb or something. That is a lot of folks that we've encountered over the last few years that have just, like I said, you do everything right. You work, you take care of yourself and everything, but your landlord just sold and there's nowhere to go. The pandemic had a huge effect on that number.
Yeah.
There was one case that both of our agencies worked with, and the person was in her 80s and had been there for decades, and the person was selling the home, and this person ended up moving off Cape. She is housed now and closer to her daughter off Cape, but it really came down to and it really came down to her living in a car, and at the
At
last
80,
minute,
wow.
and we were all working together trying to figure out a solution, and getting on those subsidized housing wait lists. There's some of them take years. Being homeless gives you a bump up in priority, but you actually have to be homeless, not at risk of homeless, before that priority takes shape. So it's there's some of those
Catch-22.
systemic challenges
Yeah.
where you're not really considered homeless until you are actually in your homeless, and then you have to prove it after a certain number of days, and it's challenging.
Yeah, that speaks a little to it. I want to kind of talk about, we have the network of organizations here in Falmouth who, are all working together to try to fill gaps, but then you do bring in the state. And so I want to talk a little bit more about if somebody becomes homeless. There's a little bit of bureaucracy there. It's not necessarily an easy thing for someone to navigate who may have any, I mean, never mind the stress of not having a roof over your head, chronic illness or mental health or trying to hold down a job. I mean,
Children that are in school here.
children that are in school. So, you know, they may encounter somebody like you, but let's talk about then what happens next.
I can speak to the issue of maybe a homeless family that is at risk of becoming homeless imminently, and I often have to have that scary conversation with them to explain what the family shelter system is, what the Massachusetts emergency shelter system is, and the way that works is that if you are homeless, documented homeless, truly homeless, you know, you call in and you schedule an intake, and sometimes you are on that phone on hold literally for hours before,
Or days.
or days. You have to
Yeah.
keep calling back, and then you have to hang up the phone to go pick up your kid, and you're still not sure where you're going. So you're inching your way towards homelessness, and if they become screened in as homeless, that means they have to go to the first open shelter bed in the state. So they're here in Falmouth. They might go to Springfield. They might go to Framingham. They might, you know, they aim to put them in a shelter as close to their home base as possible, but there's no guarantee. And I've had people take the courageous step of saying, okay, we're ready to go, and they've gotten in their car and they've headed out to Western Massachusetts because that was their only option. You know, but think about the traumatic impact that's having on the kids and the,
Right.
Yeah.
and then systemically too, sometimes just the process of being screened in for homelessness, there has to be an evaluation from the Department of Children and Families. There has to, you know, and it could, I worked with someone where it took weeks to determine their homelessness. So,
You mean the fact that they were homeless?
to prove
right?
that they were homeless, yes.
Right.
And
right.
then ultimately they were deemed ineligible because it was something about I don't really.
Wasn't it like some
was
pandemic assistance or something
pandemic
that bumped
assistance
them
money
just
that
over the
bumped them
line?
literally dollars over the income limit, and it was screened out.
Yeah.
You know, so then churches came together, HAC came together, Duffy Health Center came together to house this
Right.
family in, you know, in hotels until we could try and, you know, advocate for them at the state level to relook at this. And ultimately, I don't even recall which agency it was, but, you know, they were placed off Cape, not in a shelter, but they found a rental that someone, I think through the goodness of their heart, just rented to them on a very low, for a very low rent. But within a few months, within 6 months after that, they were housed in a local affordable unit. So happy
Right.
to report that after all of that, they are remaining in Falmouth, and the kids remained going to school in Falmouth.
Going to school in
But-
Falmouth, right.
I feel like that's becoming the exception to the rule, though,
Yeah,
right?
it
With
was
the limited ability to find the affordable units,
Yeah.
right? It's like there's different stages that someone might go through. You kind of illustrated at a high level. But
And someone that's experiencing the stress and the trauma of going through the process doesn't understand these systems, doesn't know the phone numbers to call or the language to use. Like, it's very, you know,
Right.
you need a professional housing advocate, which is what we have here, to really walk through the process. Any person that just tries to do it on their own would be significantly challenged with it.
Yeah.
We're challenged by it.
yeah,
Because there's a lot of silos, and if you get in the wrong queue, the wrong
And you don't
line,
know.
you don't
Yeah.
know, and you wasted time or
Yeah.
effort, or, you know, it's not clear which line you should be in.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Which is part of what our case management
exactly.
do is when people come into belonging to each other, one of the first things they do is start getting their identification lined up and then helping them get onto the right list.
yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
much more individualized. I remember one of our board members, when I first started working at Belonging to Each Other, talking about doing the sleep out, you know, the longest night of the year. And she was talking about how the next morning when she left her tent, she was exhausted. And,
yeah.
you know, she was not only exhausted, but she was cold and she was hungry. And thinking about what she was going to do next was really hard to do. And imagine that is your life, you know.
Yeah.
You're trying to get through the night, and then the next day you have to get up and maybe go to your job or, you know, do something like that. And your brain is so focused on just getting through that it's impossible to take the next step and get screened by DCF or get over to Belonging to Each Other. So it's a whole different mindset for people.
Yeah.
I like to counter with, like, being homeless is the worst day of your life every single day.
Yeah.
You're literally reliving your worst day every single day.
Yeah.
So you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with, all these organizations, as you said, of people who really specialize in understanding how to navigate the system, there's still just so many hurdles.
Yeah.
I mean, Housing Assistance has a lot of programs kind of in-house to try to help steward somebody along. Talk a little bit about that. When you encounter somebody, you get them to a hotel or a shelter. Talk about what you do.
Well, one of the first things we have to do is find out, it's like I said, making sure they're in the right line. So say one of our outreach workers goes out and finds someone, one of the first things we're trying to find out, is that person actually homeless? What's the age? Because, there's different, services for people under 25. So first thing we're trying to do is get all that bulk information to make sure that, they are appropriate for our outreach team, because they may be qualified for another, HAC program. But once we kind of settle on whether they're a good fit for outreach, we meet with them, and then we have to really go over their options, which are extremely limited, in terms of the long game. We could fill out the applications and connect to the services and get to the IDs and get you ready for housing, but in that single moment, the only thing we can really offer is shelter placement, which, there's only one shelter on Cape Cod. It's in Hyannis.
For individuals, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it has 40 beds for men and 20 beds for women or something like that. And a wait list with 200. So a lot of times, you're saying, look, I can get you on the list for the shelter. That's all I can do for you right now. If it's extremely cold, like we had that Arctic snap, we have a little bit more, leeway to throw someone into a hotel or connect someone to the hotel program or whatever.
For just a few days until it warms up.
The emergency hotel programs that we're talking about are run by Duffy Health Center, and the shelter has an emergency called Overflow, so that they have additional funding through the state to open up hotel rooms, when temperatures reach a certain temperature. And then for Falmouth folks, we work with Duffy to place them in local hotels too, but that is strictly based on the weather. So once conditions are not as dangerous, they exit again. So there's this in and out, throughout the winter months.
And so if there's a wait list and let's say it is more mild, let's say it's April or May, but there is no bed in Hyannis, what does somebody do? Where do they go?
We basically have to make a painting out of a rock. A lot of times we're gonna, give them what they need. Are you in your car? Do you need a sleeping bag, a blanket? Do you need socks, warmers, anything like that? We'll try and tell them, like, we can't tell them where to camp, but we can kind of give them ideas of where it's a little bit more safe, where you might be a little bit more protected, not people walking up to your car being told to move along. But that's it, really just kind of point them in the right direction. Look, here's our card. Call us. We'll find you. We're going to keep working with you at the long game.
Right.
But this is what we could do for you right now. If it's a tent and a sleeping bag right now, unfortunately, that's your night.
Stark.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what we're doing in the summer is, people we've placed in the past, trying to keep them where they're. The easiest way to place somebody is to keep them from falling out, right? So if, they're still in the process of learning how to be a good tenant or what have you, we'll go in and help them with whatever issue it is. Whether it's, heating, it's getting too expensive, I don't know whether to pay my rent or my oil bill, those kind of things, that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in, as we know, an age of unbelievable inflation that doesn't seem to be curbing, and we know energy prices have been so high all winter. I imagine it can be really difficult for those who are housed, but just barely, right? They're one step away from losing that situation. Making those choices must just be heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt.
We have a new governor, Maura Healey, who has, new to office, only been in office for a couple of months, but has talked quite a bit about placing housing and homelessness at the top of her agenda. Does that seem hopeful? Do you see help from the state? I mean, Governor Charlie Baker, I think, also had his own kind of ideas on how to address homelessness, and certainly talked about the housing crisis, because we have one here on the Cape and the islands, and then across the state. It's particularly acute, I think, down here. But I kind of wanted to see what you thought about having Mara Healy up on Beacon Hill.
Well, I mean, I think it remains to be seen because, you know, one of the issues we face here on the Cape is we are a rural community, essentially. And most of the funding for homelessness gets focused on, you know, essentially the big metropolis in Boston and maybe to a lesser extent Springfield. But, I mean, it's only been recently, I think, that even some organizations on the Cape have started to get some state funding because, you know, there's a recognition that, you know, yes, indeed, there's homelessness on Cape Cod. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, how many people, you know, when you explain you're working for an agency that works in the homelessness area, we have homelessness on the Cape, you know, and certainly that's there, you know, at the state level. And it's, you know, with the seasonal nature of the population, the numbers look especially depressed in the Cape because the only people who are counted are sort of the year-round residents, where this is their permanent residence. And the folks that are sort of not on the radar at all don't get counted. You know, it's difficult to get enough resources.
I was going to mention too that we're talking a lot about the delivery of services, but also regionally, there's a lot of coordination on advocating for us as a region at the state level. There's something called the Regional Network on Homelessness, which is coordinated by Barnstable County Human Services, and there's you know, leadership representation from HAC and from Duffy and from the different municipalities, and there's you know, legislators and legislative aides that attend those meetings too, to really you know, send the message to Capitol Hill that
In Beacon Hill.
In Beacon Hill. I was like, there's something wrong with that. That you know, we need the additional funding down here on the Cape. So that's been, I think that the reason why we try and do this regional approach and this collaboration is that we're stronger together, and if we can coordinate our resources and our data and our numbers, you know, and that gets sent as a region to Beacon Hill, then that will hopefully translate into more funding to the region.
Yeah, we each try to work in our area of strength or sweet spot and not duplicate if we can, and you know, and share resources. It's been really marvelous, I think, to work in an environment where people collaborate rather than compete. You know,
And vitally important
very,
when you
very
think
much
about
so.
the number of
People would
people.
die. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, this is a life or death issue.
Right.
We mentioned it a little earlier, but I want to kind of revisit. We're running out of time, but if someone is in danger of losing their housing, or if someone's watching who knows of someone who is now homeless, can we tell them what they should do?
I think it's going to be shown at the end of the program, our contact information, but I think if they contact Falmouth Human Services, Housing Assistance Corporation, or belonging to each other, we will, you know, get them in the right lane,
right place,
as Tim says.
If you call the you know, you get in the wrong line, we will help you get to the right line. So if someone makes a call and you get passed on to someone else, don't think we're passing the buck. We're putting you in the right spot.
Well, that's a good way to think of it.
Know.
And what do you want folks who are watching, who are stably housed, who may be thinking, wow, this is such a big issue, I'm paralyzed. What could somebody do to help?
Well, I mean, we rely very heavily on volunteers. We have, at this point, close to 80, including high school students, you know, and so get involved, learn about the issue, advocate with the town select board, advocate at the county level for an understanding of what is needed, and understand when you see housing, you know, being built, that there is a need for it, and that need could be, you know, for ultimately someone who's your grandchild or your child or a neighbor, you know, who needs it.
So people should call us if they want to volunteer.
Absolutely.
Or if they want more information about how to advocate.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and the same with housing assistance, and we have advocacy classes too. If somebody wants to understand how they can speak to maybe a town board or at a town meeting or write a letter, we can help with that, among many other things.
Yeah.
I think it's really important too. I feel like the issue, the crisis of affordable housing is talked about so much, but we can't lose sight of the fact that includes the folks on this end of the spectrum that aren't currently housed. There needs to be a safe, stable pathway for them to exit homelessness. So that means not only do we need, affordable single-family homes and accessory dwelling units and, zoning changes and that type of thing, but we need transitional housing, we need permanent supported housing. There needs to be additional emergency shelter. So the issue of affordable housing begins with folks that are not currently housed.
Right.
Absolutely.
It really is for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Kathryn.
having us.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you for watching.